What's the first thing you think of when you hear the words Dungeons and Dragons? I'd be willing to bet that it's the fantasy role-playing game that some of your weirder friends try to get you to play. But if it's not that, maybe you heard about Dungeons and Dragons because of the Chris Pine movie that released 2 years ago, or maybe you remember Mike mentioning it on Stranger Things. What I'm almost positive you did not think of is the book series that is published alongside the game. This year is the 50th anniversary of Dungeons and Dragons, and that means there are 50 years worth of novels associated with the game. These books flesh out the lore of the world, tell stories about its most well-known characters, and provide context for the world you step into before you play the game. And when you look at the sheer amount of material written about the Dungeons and Dragons universe over the past 50 years, it makes Tolkien's Legendarium look like a hill next to a mountain. And what I'm trying to say is that this is a goldmine of deep fantasy lore just waiting to be adapted. The amount of potential within these texts that already exist is endless, and I'm utterly convinced that this is where we'll find our next Game of Thrones or our next Lord of the Rings. And when we look into this vault of lore that needs to be explored, one story stands alone. One character and his adventures across Faerun have become legend amongst D&D fanatics, and that is the story of Drizzt Do'Urden. Drizzt is a dark elf, a drow, and he's born into the vile city of Menzoberranzan. His people live under the surface of the world in the Underdark, and for centuries his race has been known as one of the fiercest in all the realms. Drow have no moral code, and they would kill everyone and anyone to advance their own status, even each other. They would do anything to serve their Spider Queen, Lolth. Drizzt, though, is different, and he lives according to his own set of moral principles. He abandons his despicable race, but they're not so quick to abandon him and forgive the fact that he denounced their precious Spider Queen. This, in a nutshell, is the basis behind the most explored character in all of Dungeons & Dragons lore. There are 39 core novels that chart the adventures of Drizzt, and they are all penned by the genius author R.A. Salvatore. It's no overstatement to say that Drizzt is one of the most widely explored figures in all of fantasy literature, but that begs the question, why doesn't everyone know who Drizzt is? Why isn't he a household name? Well, for starters, 2 Z's in any name is a hard sell. But so is Dungeons & Dragons. For those that love Dungeons & Dragons, they recognize just how deep of a game and world that D&D has to offer. But to the general public, it's still relatively underappreciated. I feel like D&D is just one layer too nerdy for most people. It fits right in a spot between The Lord of the Rings and Warhammer, and most people don't venture out beyond what J.R.R. Tolkien gave us with Middle-earth. And that is a real shame. So what I'm going to try to do today is sell you on why a series cataloging the Legend of Drizzt needs to be made. I'll talk about what I think are the most important elements in storylines that need to be depicted on screen. And maybe, just maybe, if we as fans are loud enough, we'll get this show made. So please like this video, comment on it, and subscribe for more Drizzt content. Now, let's start with the core themes shown within the Legend of Drizzt novels, which I'm sure would be the most important factor to consider for any HBO or Netflix executives out there watching this video, of which I'm sure there are many. But Drizzt is a different kind of dark elf. He's born into a family that is hungry for power, and he doesn't want to play the petty games of his people. So he runs away and eventually makes his home on the surface world. However, it's not an easy journey, because the races of the surface world like humans, dwarves, and elves all despise the drow. They are one of the most unanimously hated species in this world, and Drizzt finds that out the hard way. He looks for a home, but he's turned away from every city and settlement he comes across. He eventually makes his way toward the northernmost part of the world, a region called Icewind Dale, where the lowest of the low hide away from civilized society. And even here, he's not welcomed with open arms. But over the years, he earns himself a good reputation and makes lifelong friends along the way. He befriends the dwarf Brunner Battlehammer, his adopted daughter Catti Bree, Wulfgar the Barbarian, and Regis the Halfling. They see through Drizzt's gray skin and judge him based on the content of his character. And herein lies the core themes of what this show would be about: prejudice, morality, and friendship. These 3 themes would permeate throughout the entire show. At its core, this series would be about rising above the circumstances you're born into and redefining what home means to you. It's about being the person you want to see in this world and fighting back against bias. It's about finding your people and drilling down into the responsibility of what being a friend means. Friend is a foreign term to the drow, and anyone that could be confused as a friend is really just more like an ally, biding their time to stab you in the back just to further their own position. Drizzt wants more out of life, and he eventually forms his own fellowship of unlikely characters. There are hints of Tolkien within this step, setting up a group of companions of different races who are able to see past their differences to form undying bonds. Drizzt's main companions include 2 humans, a dwarf, a halfling, and a panther. And the panther is arguably his best friend of the bunch, so get your bank account ready, Amazon. We're gonna have a cute cat in the show. It'll make millions. But beyond the skin color, the height, or the class of these characters, their hearts are in the same place. Drizzt is from a legendarily evil race. Catti is the adopted human daughter of Bruno the Dwarf, Regis is the thief from the south of the world, and Wulfgar's barbarian tribe quite literally waged war upon Bruno's dwarven clan. Drizzt's friends teach the audience time and time again that one sees clearly only with their heart, that some of the strongest bonds come from some of the hardest scenarios. And this is a story that's deeper than what you might expect. But of course, all of these themes are disguised by countless dragons, battles, and adventures. And we can't talk about Drizzt without talking about the fantasy setting of D&D. This story takes place in D&D's Forgotten Realms series, which is a campaign setting for the tabletop game. In literature, anything within this series features ancient settlements that were lost to time, colonies that were buried beneath the surface world, and forgotten as distant memories. This theme speaks for Menzoberranzan, where Drizzt is born, but it also describes the Drow themselves. The people of the surface world have heard rumors about the Dark Elves, but they very rarely emerge from their caverns, miles beneath the surface. They're an ancient race lost to darkness, but they're a very real power player in the Underdark ecosystem. Other races that fall into the same category are the Dwergar, the dark versions of dwarves, and the Svirfnebli, deep gnomes that neighbor Menzoberranzan in their own great city, Blingdenstone. And of course, who could forget the countless monsters that exist in the caverns of the underworld? Most prominent are the Mind Flayers, who play a major role in Drizzt's own story. Mind Flayers are a secretive, advanced society of Illithids, who feast on and control the brains of those less fortunate. In the other dark corners of this world, there are hook horrors, cave fishers, and displacer beasts. And of course, there are more commonly known races like kobolds, goblins, and orcs. But there are no enemies greater to the Drow than the Drow themselves, and there is a constant quest for power in Drow politics. Each major family is part of a ranking system, demonstrating the status that each house has. House Baner, the first and oldest family, rules Menzoberranzan in the number 1 rank, while Drizzt's family starts the story at rank number 10. There's a council among the first 8 houses, and with that prestige comes power. So House Duerden is desperately trying to rise through the ranks as the story starts, and they're trying to use Drizzt to do so. But as I've stated before, Drizzt does not comply. And it's a beautiful story, but I won't spoil that story for you here. Instead, I'll move on to the last section of this video, where I'll give my opinions on how to best adapt a television show about Drizzt. And to start off quite controversially, I don't think it should be called The Legend of Drizzt. I think it should just be called Forgotten Realms, and I do not make this decision lightly. Like I said before, I think seeing the name Drizzt in a television show title might be a barrier to entry for a lot of the normies out there. And I think the name Forgotten Realms is much more inviting to new fans. Plus, you could use this series as a foundation for spin-offs, and we could get other Forgotten Realms shows afterward that focus on other sections of the D&D mythos. Another big question that is bound to come up would be which of the 39 novels about Drizzt should be adapted. And despite how I may sound, I'm not crazy enough to think that I could pitch a show that would run for 39 seasons. So, in my version of a Drizzt show, it would focus on the earlier novels in Drizzt's first major arc. The first arc within these novels consists of 13 books, and it is appropriately titled The Legend of Drizzt. And to tell the story the way I think is best, you need to adapt the first 9 of those books. In my opinion, the 9th book serves as the perfect closure to this story, whereas books 10 through 13 continue on a slightly divergent path. And with all of this in mind, I think you could adapt those novels within 7 seasons. I think the 7th and 8th books can be compressed into 1 season, because they focus mostly on internal dialogue and cover a shorter amount of in-world time than the other novels. And in maybe my most controversial take yet, I believe you can mostly skip the 3rd novel called Sojourn. This novel is grounded, and it is great in a vacuum, but it doesn't contribute much to the continuous story that is the focus of the other novels. And I think if you were to spend an entire season adapting Sojourn, many fans of the first 2 seasons may lose interest before season 4 begins. I think this story would suffice as a 1-episode recap, where Drizzt is journeying from town to town, being turned away because of his ebony skin. And the episode ends with him finding his way to Icewind Dale, where the rest of the season would play out adapting the Crystal Shard. And again, if there's any television executives out there thinking, 7 seasons sounds like quite a big upfront commitment, I'm here to tell you that it doesn't have to be. Because this is a continuous story, there are many exit points that could serve as fulfilling endings if 7 seasons sounds too long. You could cut the story after season 2 and end on a hopeful note where Drizzt leaves the Underdark and is on his way to a better life. You could cut the story after season 5, where Drizzt and his companions finally take back the legendary Mithril Hall, and Drizzt is finally amongst a group of people where he can live without judgment. But of course, the preference would be to see this series all the way through to season 7, where we can witness the terror of House Baner and Drizzt's reunion with his family. On the flip side, if you wanted to make even more Drizzt content, the 10th book, Passage to Dawn, would make a really great post-series movie. This novel is just made to be a movie. It features a lot of returning characters, and it's a more fun adventure than some of the darker tales that come before it. But the last major point I want to make about how to adapt this series lies in what would be seasons 3 through 5. The novels that these seasons would adapt would be The Crystal Shard, Streams of Silver, and The Halfling's Gem. These were the first novels written for the series, but they are technically books 4 through 6 in chronological order. When demand grew for this character, Ari Salvatore returned to the series to flesh out Drizzt's backstory, writing what would become books 1 through 3. But because Ari Salvatore wrote books 4 through 6 first, they don't have anything to do with Drizzt's family or Drow society, which is a huge shift from the focus of the first trilogy and the story that comes afterward. When reading the books chronologically, this gap in storytelling feels apparent, and as I was reading the novels, I kept waiting for the Drow storyline to come back into play. And of course it does eventually, but you have to wait 3 whole books before book 7 gives you the payoff that you've been waiting for. I think this would be very jarring if adapted the same way for the screen. So in my mind, it would be paramount to develop an arc to keep the Drow storyline going throughout seasons 3 through 5. And there's room within the story to do this. When the Drow storyline picks back up in book 7, characters we've known from before have changed. Some are in different places of power, and a lot of character development is assumed, not shown. With 3 whole seasons to play with, you could answer a lot of questions that book 7 simply did not have the time to do. And you could use these 3 seasons to develop House Boehner into an even larger threat, so that when that reunion with Drizzt happens, the payoff is that much sweeter. Some might think that developing net new storylines for such a beloved story is scary, but I view it as a huge opportunity. And as I'm sure you've noticed throughout the course of this video, I have a lot of opinions on this series and how to adapt it. I had to cut down the script for this video from 40 pages to 9 pages. And I don't want the conversation to end here. I'll be making a lot more content about Drizzt Do'Urden and fighting the good fight to get this series made. This video is mostly to let newcomers know who Drizzt is and why his story is worthy of an adaptation. But I want to dive even deeper for already existing fans of the series. So if that sounds like you and you want to see a video where I break down my complete 7-season plan for the show, please consider subscribing to stick along for the ride. If you also wouldn't mind liking this video and commenting about why you love Drizzt, that would go a long way to make sure that more people see this video. And the more people that we have join this movement, the more chance that we have to see this dream become a reality. And with that, thank you for watching and have a good one.